Drink it while it's hot, Mom Evans said, placing the teacup gently in front of me. His smile was too wide, too careful, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. I looked at the cup. Pale porcelain, with a chip on the rim. My favorite, oddly. That was the first clue something was off. He never remembered things like that. The tea was darker than usual, not the herbal mix I preferred. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. 1 week ago, I had stood in a quiet corner of the bank, staring down at a paper I was never supposed to see. A life insurance policy. My name on the line marked insured. Evan's name, my only son, clearly written under beneficiary. The amount 7 figures. Enough to erase his debts. Enough to make me disappear. He sat across from me now, sipping his own tea like nothing in the world had shifted. I reached for my cup. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the effort to stay still. I let it tilt just enough to spill. The tea spread quickly across the tablecloth. Oh, let me get that he started. No, I said, grabbing the other cup before he could. No use wasting good tea. Take mine. He froze for half a second, just half, then nodded and took it. I watched him raise it to his lips. I watched him drink. Minutes passed. He chatted about meaningless things, weather, groceries, some new podcast, but his eyelids began to twitch. His breath grew shallow. His skin, always a little pale, flushed pink. Then damp. Mom, he muttered. I feel strange. I stood and walked to the phone, dialing with steady fingers. My son isn't acting right, I told the dispatcher. He's disoriented, sweating, might be medical. Please send someone. He slumped slightly in the chair. I brought him a towel, rested it on the armrest without speaking. My eyes stayed on his face, not in anger, but observation. I wanted to see the moment he realized he wasn't in control. The sirens drew closer, echoing down the street. It started with a slip of the tongue. I had gone to the bank to transfer some savings into a short-term CD. A clerk I'd spoken to before, polite but new, scrolled through my records and said, "Oh, looks like your insurance premium went through." All approved. I blinked. "I'm sorry, what insurance?" He frowned slightly, clicking around the screen. "Oh, it's a life policy. Must have been processed last week." "Wait. Oh, it says here. Evan Rowan, primary." Everything else in the room went quiet. I asked to see the file, and he hesitated, but printed a copy. I stepped away from the counter and unfolded the paper by the window's hands, suddenly too cold for summer. It was all there. My name underinsured. Evans under beneficiary. A 7-figure payout immediate upon accidental death. I stared at his signature. Neat. Intentional. Not rushed. The form was barely a week old. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked out with the paper tucked beneath my checkbook and drove home with both windows down as if wind might carry away the weight in my chest. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the fridge hum to the ache behind my ribs, to the faintest echo of a boy who once held my hand and asked why bees died after stinging. I waited for that version of him to reappear. He didn't. The next morning, I bought a motion-activated camera and mounted it above the hallway. I updated my emergency contact to my neighbor Nora and mailed a revised copy of my will to my attorney in Eugene. I didn't leave notes. I didn't call Evan. I cooked as usual. Watered the plants. Smiled when he called midweek to ask about a recipe as if nothing had shifted. But something had. I stopped looking at him like a son. I started looking at him like a variable. And I knew I needed to start watching what else he might try. 3 days after I left the bank with that policy in my purse, Evan showed up with grocery bags and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, I was thinking," he said too casually, "you and I should do that old trail again this weekend. The one by Lost Creek. You loved it." I hadn't been on that trail in years, not since my knees started complaining. And I'd read the news 2 hikers dead in the past 6 months. Both women, both falls, both alone. I set the apples on the counter and smiled like a woman who didn't already know what he might be planning. "Oh, I can't," I said lightly. "Nora's son is visiting, and she asked me to help her prep. Maybe next time." He nodded, but I caught the flicker of something behind his eyes. Not disappointment. Calculation. That night, I sat in the hallway chair pretending to read while the camera overhead recorded the quiet shape of the house. At 11:10, the porch light flicked on. Evan stood just outside the door on the phone. "She doesn't suspect anything," he whispered. "No, not yet. It's a steep trail. If she goes over, it's clean, fast, easy to handle." My chest tightened. I didn't move, didn't gasp. I waited until he left. Then I wrote it down. The time, the words, his tone, everything. I opened a fresh notebook and labeled the page with the date. I recorded when he came what he brought, how he lingered by the drawer where I kept my keys. I took photos of the tea he left in the cabinet, the ones I hadn't touched. I saved the voicemail where he asked if I still liked chamomile. I wasn't a fighter, not by nature, but I'd raised a child through storms and stomach flus and sleepless years. I knew how to outlast a threat, and Evan, whatever he'd become, was now exactly that. So I watched. I waited. And I kept the hallway light on every night after that. Looking back, Evan's unraveling hadn't begun with the insurance policy. It had been building for months, slipping through the cracks he thought I couldn't see. He'd stopped opening mail at my house, letting envelopes stack on the hall table until they curved at the edges. When I asked if he wanted me to sort through them, he'd snatch them up and shove them into his backpack, muttering something about just ads. But overdue notices have a particular weight to them. Thin paper, thick silence. His phone rang constantly, and he silenced it every time. He'd turn his head away when he declined a call, like hiding his face could erase the truth. I never pressed. Not because I didn't care, but because pushing him had always made him retreat deeper into whatever pit he was digging. Still, the atmosphere around him had changed. Tense, jumpy. Like he was waiting for someone to catch up. One evening in early summer, I stepped out to bring in the recycling bin and saw a car idling in the shadows just beyond my driveway. Dark windows, dented bumper. 2 men sat inside, staring at my house, not the neighborhood, not their phones, my house. They looked away only when they realized I was watching. A moment later, the engine growled and they pulled off without hesitation. No slow turn, no hesitation, just gone. I stood there on the curb long after the taillights vanished. I didn't call Evan. I didn't march over to his apartment demanding answers. Instead, I walked inside, grabbed a pen, and wrote down the plate number on the back of an envelope before tucking it into the kitchen drawer. The next day, Evan came by, asking if I had any spare cash, just until Friday. He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. I handed him a 20 for gas and said nothing more. If he noticed my quiet watching, he didn't show it. Whatever he was tangled in it was bigger than lies or late payments now. And the faster it closed in on him, the more certain I became that he would look for the nearest escape. And I knew exactly who he thought that escape was. The morning began with a kind of stillness that made every small sound feel louder. I was tying back the curtains when I heard Evan's footsteps on the porch, too quick, too heavy for a casual visit. When I opened the door, he stood there with a grocery bag clutched in both hands. "Thought I'd make you something nice," he said. "Your favorite blend. You used to love it." I stepped aside, letting him pass. His eyes flicked over the living room, then to the camera in the hallway. He didn't mention it, but I could tell he noticed. His smile tightened. He talked while unpacking nothing meaningful, just little scraps of conversation. The weather. a sale at the hardware store, someone from work having a baby. The words sounded memorized, stitched together with a nervous energy he kept trying to hide. Every pause seemed too long. Every glance felt like he was checking whether I suspected anything. I sat at the kitchen table while he boiled water, measuring leaves with a precision he'd never shown before. He brought the tray over a few minutes later, placing it between us. 2 cups. I saw it immediately. One was slightly darker, a faint cloudiness drifting across the surface. He nudged the darker cup toward me. Made it just how you like, he said. I rested my hand around the warm porcelain and felt my pulse steady. I didn't shake. I didn't blink. I let my wrist angle just slightly, the cup tipping enough to send the tea spilling across the table. "Oh, sorry," I murmured, reaching for a napkin. "Here, no use wasting good tea." "Take mine." I slid the untouched cup toward him before he could react. For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Confusion, worry. Then he masked it with a smile that was too quick, too thin. "Sure, Mom," he said, lifting the cup. He drank. I watched the way his throat moved, the way his hand tightened around the handle, the way he exhaled afterward, like he expected relief. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though everything we'd avoided saying now hovered between us, waiting for the next shift in the air. It didn't take long. 5 minutes, maybe less, before Evan's words began to thicken, like his tongue had forgotten where to rest in his mouth. He kept talking, pushing through the syrup of his own voice, insisting he was just tired, that he hadn't eaten. He tried to stand, bracing a hand on the table, but his balance wavered. The chair legs scraped loudly as he caught himself. "Must be low blood sugar," he muttered, breathing too fast. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, steady still. I watched him, not with anger and not with triumph, but with the cold clarity that comes when a line has been crossed and you realize there is no way back to where you were before. If I panicked, if I hesitated, I knew I might not get another chance to keep myself alive. He reached for the counter, missed it, and staggered. That was enough. I walked to the phone and dialed 911, keeping my voice even. "My son isn't acting right," I said. "He's confused," slurring his words unsteady. It came on very suddenly. Evan sank into a chair, blinking as if the room had changed shape around him. His hands trembled on his knees. He tried to speak, but only managed broken fragments. I stood a few feet away, close enough to answer questions, far enough not to be pulled into whatever came next. The sirens arrived quickly, flashing across the kitchen windows. 2 paramedics stepped inside, their questions brisk and practiced. "What did he drink?" one asked. "He made the tea," I said. "Both cups are still on the table." They collected them immediately, sealing each in a plastic bag. One paramedic knelt beside Evan, shining a light into his eyes. Evan flinched, barely conscious now, his breath shallow. "We're taking him in?" the paramedic said. I nodded, stepping aside as they lifted him onto the stretcher. The front door closed behind them, leaving a hush in the house that felt strangely hollow. I watched their lights disappear down the street, then turned back toward the table where the 2 empty cups still sat, waiting for whatever would come next. They came just after 9. 2 detectives in plain clothes badges at their belts, polite but firm. I invited them in and offered coffee, which they declined. "We have the preliminary toxicology report from the hospital," one said, setting a folder on my kitchen table. "Your son's system showed high levels of a prescription sedative, far above anything considered therapeutic." I nodded. "We also tested your cup," he added. "No trace of the drug." "I didn't drink it," I said. They asked me to recount the morning from the moment Evan arrived. I did, slowly, carefully, retracing each step with the same deliberation I'd used while living it. I told them about the grocery bag, about the way he insisted on making the tea himself, about the 2 cups, how one looked different, cloudier, darker, about the spill, the swap, his hesitation, about the way his hands trembled after he drank. I said nothing more than what happened. No accusations, no opinions. One of them took notes while the other listened. They never interrupted. When I finished, I stood and walked them to the hallway. I showed them the camera, small tucked near the coat hooks. I opened the app on my phone and played the recording. Evan entering. The bag in his hand. Him walking toward the kitchen. They watched the moment he returned with the tray. Watched him place it on the table, watched him push one cup toward me. Watched me spill and slide the other cup his way. There's no audio, one asked. No, I said. Just motion. It was enough. They collected the tea packets still in the cabinet. They took both cups. They asked for Evan's phone, which I had placed in a sealed bag after the paramedics left. I handed it over without a word. One of them looked at me before leaving. You've been very clear. I had to be, I said. They left quietly, promising to follow up. I sat down in the empty kitchen after they were gone, staring at the two faint rings the teacups had left on the wood. They hadn't vanished. They just needed the right light to be seen. The detectives returned 2 days later this time, carrying a thicker folder. They placed it on my table with the same quiet care one might use with something fragile, though nothing inside it felt delicate anymore. We've been piecing everything together, one began. There are a few things you should be aware of. I nodded, though part of me wanted to stand up and walk out of the room. They opened the folder anyway. Pharmacy records first. A receipt showing Evan had purchased a bottle of sedatives 10 days before he brought me the tea. Not prescribed to him, but bought under a loophole over-the-counter sleep aids that, taken in high doses, were dangerous. The detective tapped the date with his pen. He planned ahead, he said quietly. Next came printouts of Evan's browsing history, searches about dosage amounts, how long certain drugs stayed detectable, how to mask the taste. Pages and pages all within the same week. I kept my hands on my lap so they wouldn't shake. Then the insurance details. The company had confirmed Evan called twice, asking about waiting periods and how accidental death was legally defined. He'd asked if falls were covered, asked whether the payout was immediate, asked if there were exceptions for family members. I felt something in my chest tighten, not shock, not disbelief, but the ache of a truth settling into place, a truth that had been growing roots long before I chose to acknowledge it. He also searched the trail you mentioned, the detective continued. Read articles about the recent fatalities there. I closed my eyes briefly. The trail, the invitation, the tea. All threads from the same pattern. They kept talking about evidence chains, next steps, the district attorney, but their voices grew faint. My son's choices were now ink on paper, dates and times, and records that didn't lie. His decisions existed without excuses, without context, without the softness of memory. But grief doesn't follow paperwork. It rises slowly in waves, tugging at the edges of every quiet moment. When the detectives finally left, I stayed at the table staring at the folder. Evan had made his choices. Now I had to carry the truth of them, and carrying it, I knew would change what came next. 2 days after Evan woke up in the hospital, they arrested him. The officers didn't knock on my door that time. They called instead, letting me know it had been done. Attempted poisoning, attempted fraud, endangerment. They read the charges calmly, like they were listing groceries. I wrote them down anyway, just to see them in my own handwriting. Seeing made it real. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just nodded, thanked them, and hung up. Later that afternoon, someone knocked. I opened the door to find his wife Ashley standing there, her face drawn and red around the eyes. She looked smaller than I remembered. Please, she whispered. You can fix this. Tell them you misunderstood, that it was all a mistake. I didn't move. He didn't mean to hurt you. He was just desperate. He thought she choked on the words. He thought you'd never know. I watched her. Not with anger, but with a kind of quiet finality. There was nothing I could give her. Not comfort. Not forgiveness. Not revision. "I'm sorry," I said softly. And then I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't yell. I simply stepped back into the stillness of my own home and let the lock click into place behind me. From that moment on, I chose not to follow the court hearings in detail. I gave my statement. I let the rest unfold without me. Instead, I returned to my garden. The tomatoes had gone wild while all of this brewed behind the scenes. The squash needed retying. I spent the mornings pruning, digging, trimming away what had overgrown and what had no business taking root. The rhythm helped. So did the silence. No calls from Evan. No more surprises at the door. Just the sound of my shears, the wind against the fence, and the feeling of soil beneath my fingernails. It didn't heal everything, but it gave me ground again, something solid to stand on. And as I watched the first green shoots push through the dirt, I knew the last chapter was about to begin. The final meeting with the detectives was brief. Just a matter of signing the last page, confirming my statement, one last time. The case would move forward without me now, evidence in place, timeline, clear, intent, undeniable. They thanked me for my cooperation. I thanked them for their patience. Outside the station, the afternoon air held a soft chill, the kind that reminded me summer had quietly given way to something calmer, more deliberate. I zipped my coat and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the light fall across my face. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt older. Not in a bitter way, but in the way that happens when you've carried something too heavy for too long and finally get to set it down. On the drive home, I thought about Evan, not the man who'd poured sedatives into a teacup, but the boy who once pressed dandelions into my recipe books, who cried when his goldfish died, who used to curl up on the couch beside me with a blanket and 100 questions about the world. I thought of how hard I tried to hold him steady, and how much of him still slipped away. Back in my kitchen, I filled the kettle. The same kettle he had used. The same counter. The same chipped mug. I chose a tea I hadn't touched in weeks. A blend I once loved. I boiled the water. Steeped the leaves. Let the steam rise into the quiet of my home. And when it was ready, I sat at the table where it all happened, where it nearly ended, and I drank. Not to forget. Not to forgive. But because I was still here. The tea was warm. Familiar. A small, steady thing. And this time it was mine. I sipped it slowly, watching the light shift across the floor, and felt something settle. Not relief, not peace, but the start of both.